So today, inshallah, I'm going to start a topic that is the reality of sectarianism. They divide the people of their religion into two broad categories, those that are practicing and those that aren't practicing. European Christianity is far more guilty of the worst manifestations of sectarianism. 8 million people killed by swords. Sectarianism is nothing unique to the Muslim Ummah. People that are non-religious don't really care what version of religion you follow. But your local sheikh, in all likelihood, is very interested. You are not a Sunni if you don't respect all of the Sahaba. Interfaith dialogue is infinitely easier than intra-faith dialogue. We have invited Christian ministers into the Musalla. Nobody has a problem. To this day, we have never invited a single 12 or Ithna Ashari to our mosque. Ibn Taymiyyah would not speak like the Ibn Taymiyyah of the 7th century if he lived in our times. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah ma ba'd. So today we are starting a new segment of our Lighthouse series. As you're aware, we have divided our Lighthouse series into specific modules, and we spend a few weeks on every single module. So today, inshallah, I'm going to start a topic that is actually of great interest to me personally. I've spoken about this quite a lot. I have obviously myself interacted with this reality and phenomenon in different phases of my life in different ways. And it is one that every single one of us is involved with, aware of, and we all have to make a decision about how we're going to navigate. And I mean here, of course, the reality of sectarianism. Now, I thought that today I would do something different because we're trying to look at this topic in a fresh manner. We're trying to understand the phenomenon of being divided into groups and how to deal with this reality. And so today what I'm going to do is actually take a bit of a tangent and talk about a prelude, a foreword, if you like, to the concept. I will not be quoting a hadith and ayat today. I'm not going to be quoting specific groups today. That's going to come. We're going to talk about those realities, inshallah, in the future classes. Today I wanted to talk about it from a sociological and a psychological paradigm. The phenomenon of a group splintering and dealing with the intra-group dynamics is a phenomenon that is well observed, and it occurs in every single group of people. In fact, one of the observable realities is that every time a group reaches a critical mass, there is inevitably a split that occurs. It's actually quite interesting. No matter what the group is, whether it's a religious group, whether it's a social group, or it's a political group, whatever it might be, after a certain critical mass, inevitably tensions grow and ideas come that are interpreted in different ways, and group dynamics changes. And so you always have, let's say, a large umbrella group. Underneath that you have various sub-factions, all of them competing for their own peoples and legitimacy. So it's nothing new just to happen amongst religious folks. However, when it happens within the religious community, it actually has slightly different realities and connotations, which again are observable across many different religions, and they're all the same, i.e., the phenomenon that we observe, we can find parallels in all faith traditions and not just within the Muslim community. And so today, inshallah, I'm going to summarize specific psychological and sociological biases and factors that I want us to be aware of as we venture down this very convoluted topic of sectarianism. And I want to begin by stating the obvious. This is an observed phenomenon, and I guarantee there are people in this audience that they will actually resonate with what I'm about to say. And that is, when people are not that religious, when they're not aware of religion and religiosity, when they're not aware of the various denominations, when they are themselves either not practicing or practicing in a personal level, not associated with the group, then generally speaking, they divide the people of their religion into two broad categories, those that are practicing and those that aren't practicing. Those that are observant is the term non-Muslims use. We Muslims use practicing. Christians, others say, are you observant? Are you going to the church regularly? So those that observe the rituals, those that are practicing, or those that are not practicing. Now, the irony, and every one of you knows this or are currently experiencing it or have experienced it. The irony, as you grow in your religiosity and knowledge, what you thought was one large camp of religious folks starts to become clear demarcations of many types of religious folks. And what you thought would be one big, lump of people, just large groups of all, mashallah, happy, hunky-dory, mashallah, just singing kumbaya, because they're all religious folks, you actually come to realize that amongst the religious folks, the level of animosity and hatred and cutting off and stabbing of the backs is far more vicious than amongst non-religious folks. And initially there's a puzzlement, initially there's a disgust, initially there's a sense of hypocrisy, but then, shock and awe, as you start associating more with a particular group, particular set of scholars, as you're introduced to, I call it dogma, but of course they would call it the correct tradition or ideology or orthodoxy, you actually begin to sympathize with the visceral reaction against others. Oh, those are the other, those are the bad people. What you initially rejected when you started your religious journey, if you continue with any group, this is not just any one group, by the way, every group without exception, when you continue in that journey, you actually start forming emotions that you didn't have towards people in the practicing religious group, in the religiosity group. You didn't have that distinction when you were not religious. You just all lumped them together. But as you grow, and you think you're growing spiritually, and in some ways you are, and as you grow in your knowledge of the religion, all of a sudden you yourself, unwittingly, you start sympathizing with these demarcations. And if you remain within that movement, inevitably you will start doing the very things you yourself were troubled and puzzled by as a part of the marker of being in that group. And by the way, this is an observed phenomenon across all different movements and sects, not just within Islam. And of course, Europe is particularly guilty of this phenomenon, much more than Muslims ever were, by the way. European Christianity is far more guilty of the worst manifestations of sectarianism than Muslims ever were. I mean, all of you have studied basic European and Western history. That's a part of our, upbringing. That's what we study. We study the trajectory of Western thought. And Europe is defined by religious sectarianism. The 30 Years' War between the Catholics and Protestants, right, lasted more than 30 years, estimated over 8 million people killed. 8 million before the era of bombs. We're talking about 1600s. 8 million people killed by swords, one after another. The entire, Europe is embroiled in controversies over what? They're both Christians. They're both invoking Jesus as they attack one another. Over what? Doctrines of substantiation. Is the bread real or not? You guys know this. I'm being a bit facetious, but that's exactly what it is. Is the wine real or not? And they're killing one another. Countries are formed. Belgium and France, and the borders of these countries are formed based upon abstract theological controversies. It's crazy, but that's reality, right? And the same goes for, and in fact, we're going to come back to this point. The 30 Years' War, frankly, triggered secularism. The 30 Years' War is why we are the way we are in this country. The Treaty of Westphalia is literally coming right after the 30 Years' War. I'm going into tangent here, but you guys need to know this stuff. This is our identities, core Western value identities. What defines us. The failure of Christian sectarianism is what led to what we now call secularism. The Treaty of Westphalia, the border states, the nation states, right? In which, quite literally, in the treaty, you have language that basically says, we're not going to kill one another because of doctrinal differences. This is something that is a core defining characteristic of what it means to be a Western. In fact, our founding fathers, the country, the 13 colonies, what were they? Each of the 13 colonies was a different Christian sect. You all remember this from your high school, right? Those junk courses you studied were not junk courses. They're very important. Yes, you have to restudy them because those were brainwashed. They were taught to you in selective, facts here and there. But those concepts are actually very important. The 13 colonies, why were there 13 colonies? Because there were 13 different movements of Christianity. They didn't want to really live next to each other. They wanted to have their separate, understandings of religion and providence. So, point being that, of course, after the 30 Years' War, you have, of course, others, the French War, right? And the trajectory of France, and why is their version of secularism, laïcité, so different than American secularism? Because of their trajectory. Why is there such a visceral hatred of the religion amongst the French? Again, go study your history. And in England as well, the English Civil War. I mean, King Charles I was beheaded, was executed. Literally it ended up in a monarch losing his life. You've all studied or seen the movies or whatever. How many hundreds and thousands of British people were burnt at the stake? Why? Because this guy is a Protestant, this guy is a Catholic, whatever it might be. Queen Mary of the Scots, right? How many thousands of innocent intellectuals and scientists and people of the clergy were literally killed because they had a different idea about Jesus? Not because they were godless, not because they were Mohammedans and Muslims, but because their version of Christianity was slightly different than the version of the Catholics and others. So, point is that sectarianism is nothing unique to the Muslim Ummah, and frankly, historically, we have dealt with it far better than many of the other groups. But it is an observable phenomenon that differences in religion easily generates fanaticism. And we're looking at this reality right now with the Iran situation. I'm just being blunt here. That's just a reality. Look at the online rhetoric between some of the preachers on one side that are just, in their assessment of the situation, they're literally saying the two sides are equal, Iran and Israel, versus others that are having a different view. And the anger between Sunnis who disagree about their assessment of Iran. This is the reality we're seeing right now. So, before we jump into the hardcore religious side of things that will happen, inshallah, in next classes, before we quote Quran and Hadith and statements of scholars and how we can deal with it from a purely theological standpoint, today, very briefly, inshallah, and I hope to leave some time for Q&A. I hope so, inshallah, because one of the complaints that was received was I talk too much, and you guys don't have enough time to talk as well. So we'll try, inshallah. Time is always so limited, and there's so much to discuss. Anyway, what I wanted to do, as I said, is to teach you guys 5 psychological and sociological factors to be aware of, so that inshallah ta'ala you can mature up about understanding sectarianism. And by the way, the very fact that I'm bringing in humanities to discuss religious sectarianism is itself something of the wasati paradigm that I've introduced you to over the last few weeks, right? No other movement would want to do this, because from their standpoint, these types of sciences are of no value. We should not resort to them, because from their perspective, and it sounds good, but it's a slogan, what Allah has revealed is enough for us. And the response is, what Allah has revealed is enough for what Allah intended for it to be used for, yes. And that is to enter Jannah, without a doubt. But Allah did not reveal a book of astronomy, and the Muslim astronomers, if you listen to my lecture, went very far, because they didn't just say whatever Allah revealed is enough for astronomy. Allah didn't reveal a book because of astronomy. Allah did not reveal a book to teach us humanities. That's not why Allah revealed us a book. The reason why Allah revealed us a book, the book does the perfect job for it. And understanding human psychology, Allah did not reveal us a book for that reason. And Allah allowed us to explore and to benefit from other civilizations and cultures, even in humanities. I would say especially in humanities. Alhamdulillah, in our faith, by and large, as you know, by and large, no group actively opposed science and technology. No group has ever done this, by and large. There are some claims to fringe movements, but in reality, no mainstream movement has ever done so. But today is a classic example of a merging. We're discussing religious sectarianism, and I want to introduce you to psychological and sociological and anthropological realities. Because once you understand those, frankly, you will begin to understand sectarianism. You're actually going to have a different attitude towards sectarianism. But this very endeavor itself would be deemed semi-heretical by those on the more, remember we talked about them, the different movements out there. So those on the more dogmatic side, where they would say this is, you are mixing something that should not be mixed, and we don't need this, and we can go straight to the hadith of the 73 groups. Let's just say, just start from there. That's how most groups would start understanding sectarianism. But we'll do that. We'll do the hadith of the 73 groups, inshallah, in our next classes. Let's start off talking about 5 psychological and sociological factors that I want you to be aware of and to understand as you deal with sectarianism. Because here's the point. Our psychological and cognitive biases are ingrained in us. We are all biased at some level, but the least biased person is aware of his biases. That's what makes them the least biased. And to acknowledge a bias, to be aware of it and acknowledge it, is the mechanism to awareness, to understanding. We cannot remove ourselves from our humanity. We're always going to be assessing information from within our souls, our brains, our skulls, our eyes, from within our filter. And that filter is a mix of so many things, some of which we can never change, we're human, others of which is because we're born in a certain way, racer, others of which we acquire, our faculties, our psychology, our cognitive biases. There's so many. So, bottom line, understanding these biases, being aware of them, allows us to approach a field with more maturity. So let's begin with the first. I'm going to mention 5 of them. And by the way, this is by and large coming from me. If some of you are experts in psychology or in sociology and you want to add or correct me later on, no problem. I would appreciate that. This is all from my own readings, and because I like the subject of sectarianism, I'm actually writing some papers and some more advanced stuff on this, inshallah, for other forum other than this one. So I'm doing my own research in this regard. So this is relatively original type of stuff, and because of that, it could be either very phenomenal or it could be the exact opposite. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, so I'll welcome your feedback in this regard. Jayyid. Number 1, the paradox of being introduced to sacred values. What do I mean by this? The irony, as we pointed out, of becoming more religious and more intolerant at the same time makes complete sense when you understand introducing sacred values. So, anecdotally, we all are aware, people that are non-religious, by and large, as I said, lump all religious folks together and don't really care what version of religion you follow. You know, your grandmother, my grandmother, they don't care what the label you, is he a good person or not? Does he pray? Is he honest? They're looking at that. They really don't care about abstract values. But your local sheikh, in all likelihood, is very interested. What type of Muslim is he? What version of Islam does he follow? Why this disconnect, even though the both of them, your grandmother and your sheikh, are praying 5 times a day, loving Allah and His Messenger? Why is the one of them so concerned about specific issues and the other isn't? The issue goes back to what we're talking about right now, which is sacred values that are introduced to you and acquired in your cognitive beliefs become the core identifying marker of what you consider to be religious and sacred. I.e., your grandmother has not been introduced to advanced theology, abstract theology. She's a simple lady. She just loves Allah and His Messenger. And when she meets another Muslim who loves Allah and His Messenger, that's good enough for her. But you, mashaAllah, have attended halaqat from Sheikh so-and-so. You have gone through the manual of Aqeedah written by Imam and Hujjah and Shaykh al-Islam of the 6th or the 7th or the 8th century. Right? You have acquired a set of values that your grandmother does not have. And you have been taught, and now you believe, that those values, that dogma, that creed, that ideology is important. Your grandmother was not taught this. And you have gone through an experience, a camaraderie, halaqat. And you have been exposed to a spirituality through your lectures and your durus and whatnot that your innocent, grandmother was not exposed to. And in the process, you have come out at the end of all of that believing in the sanctity, in the sacredness of a particular idea or rituals or dogma or whatever it might be. The core defining value of that trend is now a part of you. So it becomes important to you because that's who you are. And this is actually one of the most difficult biases to overcome, because the reality is that it does define you if you want to ally yourself with that particular sect or firqa. So, for example, and I'm going to have to give some examples here, and even these examples are controversial because to merely mention them, you are shaking core values of a particular strand. But I have to give examples because that's the whole point here. We are all in this audience Sunni Muslims. What are some of the values that define Sunni Muslims? Tell me. Speak out loud. Sunni, not Muslims, Sunni Muslims. Yes. Okay, so this defines us against one group in a ritual. Very good. What else? Yes. That's one example. The integrity of the Sahaba. That is a defining characteristic of Sunni Islam. You are not really a Sunni. Technically, in modern Sunnism, I should say, classical Sunnism has a nuance. In modern Sunnism, you are not a Sunni if you don't respect all of the Sahaba. And as you remain in a Sunni circle and you attend lectures, this notion is going to be validated. It will become a part of your core identity as a Sunni. Now you meet somebody who doesn't have this value, you have acquired a sanctity of this value by virtue of the fact of you associating with that strand for so long. That value, which is a defining value of this strand, has a certain status, a certain sanctity, sacredness. That sacredness and sanctity is by and large not appreciated by your grandmother, my grandmother, because they haven't gone through your program. And so if they meet somebody of another label, they're not really asking, what do you say about this Sahabi? They're not interested in that. But because we have a value attached to a theology or a ritual or an ideology, that value was acquired. We weren't born with it. And why was it acquired? Because we associated with a particular strand. It is the marker of that strand. So when you associate with that strand, if you continue to associate, you have to carry the marker, correct? So when you carry that marker, when you associate with that marker, when that value becomes a part of your identity, you cherish it, you care about it, because that's your now new identity. You didn't know about it before, but now you do. Now again, immediately the first response is going to be, hold on a sec, isn't it important to respect the Sahaba? I didn't talk about the theology, I'm talking about the sociology right now, right? We're going to get to that issue. We're going to talk about that. Right now I'm talking about the psychology. This is just choose another example. If this one you can't think about it rationally, choose another one, anyone, doesn't matter. Whatever strand you follow, by definition, that strand has to have certain aspects that are unique to that strand. That's what makes the strand, correct? So if you are a part of that strand, they have to give value to what makes them unique, or else they become meaningless. And when you associate with that and you absorb that, well then, all of a sudden, what used to be not known to you, what used to be not on your agenda, not on your list of important factors, becomes on your list of very important factors. And that's the irony, as I said, the contradictory irony of the more religious you become, the more closer you get to a type of religious scholarship, automatically you actually begin to start looking down or looking at people differently who don't have the same ideology as you. Okay, this goes back to the paradox of what is considered sacred or sacrosanct or holy. And of course, because every firqa, every strand, every ideology has certain core values, when you associate with them, you also must make those core values sacred. Before your association, those core values would not have been sacred to you, or else you would be part of that group. Okay, so how do you overcome this, by the way? Again, by overcoming, I don't mean you have to empathize and disagree. You just have to separate, as a Muslim, you have to separate between a value that is clearly basic Quran versus a value that is derived and developed by a particular strand. And that's the only thing you need to understand. Like, there's clearly a value that is an umbrella for the entire religion, belief in one God, belief in the Prophet ﷺ, belief in Yawm al-Qiyamah. That's straight Quranic, and you will be able to tell this by the umbrella fact that all religious strands associating with Islam by and large follow that, versus a defining characteristic of one particular strand. If you find only one group derive something from the Quran and others don't, It might be a correct derivation. I'm not saying it's not correct. I'm simply saying it cannot hold the same value as a derivation that is basic Quranic. The very fact that only one segment of the ummah has derived this fact and other segments have not automatically indicates that this derivation doesn't have the same epistemic weight, the same sacrosanct status as a fact that is universal in the faith. Okay? I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Please don't misquote me in this regard. So that's the first point. The second psychological and anthropological observed reality is called the narcissism of small differences. And this is a well-observed and documented phenomenon across all strands of movements, whether they're religious, whether they're social, whether they're political, it doesn't matter. And this can be summarized with the following statements. Groups that are very similar exaggerate smaller differences to maintain their boundaries and identity. I repeat, you can put it this way. The closer the groups are, the bigger their petty differences are exaggerated. This is called the narcissism of small differences. And this is an observable phenomenon observed by, as I said, by anthropologists, by psychiatrists, by anybody who's observed large groups of people in whatever field. This is a phenomenon that transcends religion. And in fact, not to justify, I'm just saying this, even Sigmund Freud has an entire chapter about this reality. And he writes, not that I love Sigmund Freud, obviously not, but I'm saying it's an observed phenomenon. Take it from him. If you don't like him, take it from other anthropologists that have written about this. He says, it is precisely communities with adjoining territories who are the most prone to mutual hostility. Okay? When your boundaries are relatively close, you actually exaggerate your differences. The closer the ideology, the closer the theology, the more threatening the differences become. Okay? And a very simple phenomenon that the entire ummah can sympathize with, especially in the Western world, is the fact that interfaith dialogue is infinitely easier than intra-faith dialogue. I just came back from Austin, Texas today. I attended an interfaith event yesterday. There were some evangelical priests and ministers, and I was there, and we had a very nice conversation, went back and forth, agreed to disagree, whatnot. And not a single backlash from anybody is going to happen. Even though on that panel, the pastor, the minister, kept on trying to put in the fact that we believe in Jesus as the Son. He wanted to give da'wah to the Muslims, the audience. He thought that, again, anyway, it is what it is. So it's like, Jesus died for our sins, and this is the God. He keeps on saying it. And not a single Muslim is going to be insulted or problematizing the fact that I sat on the stage with him and I gave my 2 cents. I have been in numerous interfaith dialogues. We have invited Christian priests before the situation in the Middle East. We invited rabbis to our interfaith dinners before the politics was the way that it was, and nobody batted an eyelid. We have invited Christian ministers into the musalla here at Epic. And I have spoken with Pastor Bob Roberts and others here. When I was in Memphis, we invited. Nobody has a problem. To this day, we have never invited a single 12 or Ithna Ashari to our mosque. And we will not do so in the foreseeable future. Because the backlash that would happen would be astronomical. We didn't have a single backlash about interfaith. Not one person came to me, "Yeah, Sheikh, how could you have invited a Christian minister?" Everybody understands, smiling, taking pictures, right? Now, imagine if I invited a 12er cleric. And I'm being very blunt here. I'm sorry, it's going to go on lane. People are going to have their comments, so be it. I'm sick and tired of our petty-mindedness. Wallahi, it is problematic for our ummah. If the fact that I'm inviting a person doesn't mean I agree with them. It's so backward. But this is the narcissism of small differences, right? I have not yet participated in a public intra-faith dialogue to this day because I choose my battles wisely. A day will come when I will do it, and the backlash will happen, and you think I'm cancelled right now? Just wait till I dare shake hands with a Muslim who wears a black turban and has studied in Qum. Just wait. The fact that I shook hands with somebody like that, wait till the cancellations come after that. You will see. It's just the reality. I don't agree with the person. I didn't agree with the priest, but my sitting with the priest is overlooked. My sitting with a 12 cleric will never be forgiven by that demographics. The narcissism of small differences, right? The fact that they're closer to us They pray, A'udhu Billah. They read the Quran, A'udhu Billah. And because they're closer to us, right, their differences become visceral. This is an observed reality. And when you know this is an observed reality, then check yourself. Now you know this is a reality and a phenomenon that is groupthink. Why should you fall prey to it? You know why it happens, because it's demarcation. The other person represents a threat. So point number 3 is similar, but it's done by a different group of people. So again, 2 and 3, I put them in 2 different things. I think they're the same thing, to be honest, but 2 was done by psychologists, 3 was done by sociologists. So they kind of talk about it in a different way. But to me, it's the same thing. And that is the concept of social identity theory. And this was most famously promoted by a Polish intellectual by the name of Henry Tajfel. He was a Polish prisoner of war captured by the Nazis. He thought he would lose his life, and then eventually he was freed, and he went on to do phenomenal, groundbreaking research in groupthink. Like, how can people do this to other people? Right? By the way, World War II produced some amazing psychiatrists and sociologists and anthropologists to see the banality of evil, just to see how people can do this, right? And lots of books have been written about this. So here's one of the guys that basically has gone through that reality, and then he took his, obviously as a young man, then after he got out of the Nazi concentration camp, he goes to London, and he becomes a well-known sociologist, and he has this theory that he called the theory of social identity, and he is most famously associated with this. And in a nutshell, and it's very similar to point number 2, but he's looking at it from a different angle. In a nutshell, what he says is, people have the innate tendency to categorize themselves in a certain subgroup, and once that subgroup is formed, that becomes a part of your identity. It informs you of who you are, and it provides you meaning and self-worth and self-esteem. Therefore, you have to protect anything that threatens you as your identity. Once you have an identity with a group, and in our case, the group is, of course, he was talking about group being a political group. For us, the group is a religious group, let's say, right? Once your identity is shaped by a particular strand, it becomes a core value. Now, your worth, your meaning, your life becomes contingent to defending the borders of that identity. Hence, he writes, the mere act of categorization, once you have a category, a name, is sufficient to produce intergroup discrimination. In fact, he has a famous experiment that he's done multiple times in different ways, where he took groups of people. You know how they do these tests where the people think they're being tested in one way, in reality they're being tested for another. So he's done multiple experiments on large groups of people, where basically he divided people into imaginary categories, completely imaginary, completely random. And once you start identifying with a label that he just invented at the beginning of the test, he observed that people in that one label started forming cliques against the other, started hating on the other, started preferring their own people simply because of an imaginary label. Groupthink becomes subconscious because it's a part of your identity. And hence, within the same religion, boundaries have to be actively maintained, or else your identity is threatened. Like I said, the Shia guy next to me, people's identity, they would lose their minds. How dare you humanize the other, right? Because the person that's next to me in that particular case represents an actual threat to their identity. Okay, so point number 3, social identity theory, and that is that the fact that when you have an identity, automatically there's a boundary that needs to be maintained, and in order to maintain that boundary, the only way to do so is basically to reinforce what makes that identity, i.e. in this case sectarianism. Okay, that's the only way to maintain your identity, your self-worth, your esteem, your value, your social group, right? We make fun of gangs, but the fact of the matter is that at some level, the psychological reality of belonging to a gang, we're all guilty of it. It's a psychological phenomenon. My group versus the other group. At some level, even if it's human, my family versus other people, that's totally normal and natural, right? But Islamically, as Allah says, doesn't matter if your father or your mother does a crime, you cannot support them in that crime. Allah teaches us that truth rides above groupthink. But humanity, as a default, it's easy to have groupthink. And like I said, Henry Tashfeld demonstrated that groupthink is so superficial, you can invent a label, a complete nonsensical distinction. By the way, the Rwandan genocide, the Hutus and the Tutsis, maybe you're too young for this, right? But I was a young man when one of the worst genocides of our lifetimes took place in Rwanda. One of the most brutal genocides. There's a famous movie, Hotel Rwanda. It's won some awards. It's actually a very good movie about the reality of that genocide. The Hutus and the Tutsis, when the Belgians colonized Rwanda, they needed to divide and conquer. They took the same group of people and they divided them into two different tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis. They weren't actual two different tribes. The Belgians invented these two tribes. There's no DNA difference, language difference, cultural difference. There's no religious difference. They are ethnically and culturally the exact same peoples. But when the colonizers came in the 19th century, they wanted to just facilitate the divide and conquer, and so they created an imaginary two tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And when they left, when havoc, when the doors of havoc and civil war were opened up, the situation, the volatile situation, continued to exacerbate until the Hutus basically massacred the Tutsis or is it the other one? I forgot. The Hutus massacred the Tutsis. The majority of majority was one way, where how many millions of people were macheted to death? Disgusting. Over an imaginary term. Imaginary. You have the video footage, you have the audio where the Hutu general, I forgot his name, he's literally saying, kill those cockroaches on radio and television. And all of his followers are going crazy. Based on what? An imaginary label. Complete imaginary. They're the same religion, the same culture, the same language. It's just, so this isn't just an experiment that Henry Tashfeld did. Reality demonstrates groupthink is super dangerous. And you just start imagining your identity linked to one group. Imagine if it's not just a fake identity, there's actually markers of difference, different theologies, different whatnot. It becomes so much easier to have this simplistic groupthink. So this is the theory of social identity. Take a note of it. You can also read Henry Tashfeld's works on this. He has a simple book on this, and even the Wikipedia article is a nice introduction to some of the experiments that he's done. The fourth concept that I want you to be aware of, it is called cognitive dissonance amplification. Cognitive dissonance amplification. And this is most prominently championed by a very famous modern social psychologist of our times, Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, Jonathan Haidt. He's still alive. He's one of the most famous professors in this field of social psychology. And once again, he has written books and articles about this reality. And he writes, and I quote, "The bitterest conflicts are often amongst those who share the most similar beliefs," end quote. And actually, once again, this is a reality that we are all familiar with, because who are you the most jealous of, and who do you find your problems are the most easy to amplify? It's your closest circle. You're not jealous of Bill Gates, who has $50 billion. But if your cousin becomes half a multimillionaire, that's where the jealousy will come, right? If your close relative, your friend, they're more popular than you, you're not jealous of the most famous Hollywood actor or whatever they might be. But if your friend becomes the life of the party, that's where something happens, okay? There's the irony here, cognitive dissonance amplification. The bitterest conflicts are amongst those who are the closest and share the most beliefs. And this is also called, the term is sometimes used, heretic versus infidel effect. Now, these terms are not familiar to us that much because we don't use the term heretic as much as others do. We can use the term bid'ah versus kafir effect, okay? Mubtadi' versus kafir effect. The mubtadi', the Shi'i guy in our case, is considered far more dangerous in the eyes of the, I'm saying considered, I don't think so. I'm trying to be careful all the caveats here, right? Is considered far more dangerous because they claim legitimacy from our same source, the Quran, the Sunnah, the Seerah. So they become an actual threat, whereas the kafir guy represents no threat. The kafir represents nobody's worried that a person is going to become a Christian if I invite a minister to, now realistically, were I to invite a 12er, nobody's going to become a 12er. But why would there be an angry reaction? Because that's going to be the fear. Oh, you're validating. Oh, you're bringing somebody that's, potentially going to harm or corrupt. But they don't consider a non-Muslim to have that level of violence, threat of violence. Why? Because when somebody close to your belief system disagrees, when somebody who's tapping into your same trajectory disagrees with your conclusion, it creates an internal tension that an outsider will never create. Are you guys following me? Are you guys understanding this point, right? When somebody is next to you, looking up to the same sources as you, but deriving a different opinion, that is a far greater threat intellectually. You don't realize it. That's why I'm teaching you these biases, right? You don't even understand it. You're more irritated than the guy who doesn't look to your sources and hence has radically different beliefs. To you, it doesn't matter because they're not tapping into your sources. Hence, it is more important when you understand this bias to reject a dissident insider than a dissident outsider. It becomes far more important to understand that somebody who shares with you 80% of your beliefs but disagrees strongly with 20% is actually going to provoke your internal mechanism much more than somebody who disagrees with you 90% and agrees with you 10%. Ironically, and again, this goes back to the irony that I began this lecture with, right? Now you understand why. This is the cognitive dissonance amplification. To put it another way, external enemies actually bring about unity in your group. And I need you to understand this because that's another topic we're going to come to. Why do people have to create enemies? You create enemies to solidify your own. In fact, I have a whole library chat about the refutation culture. Listen to that. Why do I not refute other people that much? Because honestly, refuting, to me personally, it's actually very petty. It's a level of IQ that I think I want to dissociate from. I think the people that do that are a different wavelength than me. But the reality is that refutation culture is more about preaching to your own choir than about refuting the other person. So what happens, your external enemy represents an opportunity for you to create unity amongst your own ranks. Hence why the MAGA crowd needs us to validate their existence. You have to understand there's a psychological reality for the far right going crazy and berserk on us, knowing full well that we are not whom their intellectual leaders say that we are. They know they're lying. Our governor knows he's lying. He's too intelligent to not know this. People that are saying these things about us, they know they're lying. Why are they doing it? Because by creating an external threat, what happens? You solidify your internal identity. You understand? Now, what's going to happen if your internal identity fractures? I have to get relevant here. Our president, did you not see his tweet against Tucker and Candace and others? The visceral hatred. This is internal dissent. He hasn't even lashed out at us as much as he's lashed out at his own who has abandoned him. This is the same phenomenon. I'm sorry to be blunt here. Once you understand this sectarianism and what's happening in the MAGA crowd, it's all the same. It's that once you understand cognitive biases, you can no longer be as petty as so many of these other people are. This is why I hope when I teach you all of this, I hope, inshallah, that I want my students to reflect this maturity and wisdom and sensibility that is not found amongst those who don't go through this training. Once you understand basic cognitive biases in human psychology, you cannot resort to the types of thinkings we find in other types of people here. External enemies are actually an excuse to tighten your ranks. And it's a good mechanism to get rid of internal dissent, because when you have an external enemy, that becomes the priority. Whereas an internal dissent threatens to do what? Fracture the movement. Correct? Internal dissents are potentially lethal. External dissents are fortifying. Once you understand this, realize they are creating an external threat out of us because it's validating their system. And we have to understand this, and that obviously we're not that we like it, but it is what it is, and we need to amplify the internal dissent from amongst them, because that is the biggest threat to them. They represent a bigger threat to their internal cohesion than we do. So understand this point, cognitive dissonance amplification, and once you understand this, once again, you will understand why it is so much easier to hate on a fellow Muslim who disagrees with you on abstract issues versus somebody who's far, far away. And again, I mean, a simple reality to this as well. Some of you are very familiar with the Sufi Salafi bashing taking place constantly for the last, God knows how much time. And the reality is that the Sufis and Salafis in particular, it is so sad. They don't just agree on the fundamentals. They agree on the sources, on the giants, on the traditions. Their books are going to be exactly, by and large, the same. Their books of tafsir, of hadith, of mustalah, of lugha, they're exactly the same. The level of animosity and hatred and bashing is truly surreal. But once you understand psychology, you understand it is so high because that is the biggest threat. Far bigger than other movements. Because they're so similar, there's an oxymoronic, inverse proportionality. Your reaction is even more because you're so close, right? And so understand this point, the cognitive dissonance amplification. The final point we mentioned, and by the way, these 5 points are overlapping. I mean, they're kind of sort of, some of them are, overlapping in others, but put together, they're all bringing out the reality of the, are you kidding me? SubhanAllah, 9:08? I literally thought I had half an hour for Q&A. I am sorry, guys. I literally thought I'd give you a long time for Q&A. I purposely, wallah, as Allah is my witness, I thought let me be super short in this lecture. And here I go, finishing up. I don't know how I'm going to do this next time. I have a problem. Maybe you're right, I do talk too much. I don't know. Guilty as charged. Anyway, I hope it's beneficial. So, 5th point. And again, these are all realities that transcend sectarianism. And that is competition for authority and legitimacy. Competition for authority and legitimacy. And again, this has been commented on and observed by many anthropologists, including one of the most famous religious anthropologists, Max Weber. If you know anything about the anthropology of religion, you know Max Weber. And Max Weber writes, the competition for religious authority is a struggle for legitimacy, i.e., to be legitimate, you must have an ascription to a person or a movement or a group. And those movements or those groups, once again, they have markers of purity, status symbols, what makes them different. Whether the term is traditionalism and orthodoxy, whether it is the Salaf, whatever it might be, there's a mark of purity. There's a legitimacy that comes by attaching yourself to a group, an icon, a person. You are cleansed of any type of heresy by forming an attachment with this iconic figure that is revered amongst the people of your movement. And so the more you attach yourself to that icon, that movement, the more you establish your authority and your legitimacy in that group. You understand this point here, that if you want to, and by the way, this is true for all movements, the more you want to rise in a movement, you first and foremost have to validate your attachment to that movement. And you validate it by basically acquiescing to that movement's icons, by basically showing that you have completely absorbed and you agree with that particular ideology. And if you dare disagree at a younger stage, you are kicked out. If you reach a very high stage, you might be given the right to slightly modify, and that's how changes occur within movements. Otherwise, as a hallmark, that's just the reality. You have to spend decades validating subservience, acquiescence, because that is your mark of legitimacy. You will not rise up in their ranks until you show your legitimacy and you show you have authority by attaching yourself to the ideas, the icons, the people, the methodology of a particular strand. This happens in all movements, by the way. Once again, all movements, right? And again, sorry to be blunt, look at the MAGA phenomenon, right? Where how do you rise up in his ranks? How do you rise up? Can't be vulgar here, but you do things, yani you subserve, you show acquiescence, right? And the more you do so, what happens? Doors open up, whatnot. Believe it or not, the same applies in all movements. Even when the people are dead, they're always inheritors who think they control the keys to that guy's legacy. Always. This is the reality, right? And if you wish to have that legitimacy, then you have to have the attachment to whatever, that person was famous for. So within a religion, therefore, what are classical theologians famous for? They're famous for their interpretations of Islam. So if you want authority and legitimacy, you will have to show your subservience to their interpretation. And of course, what I say is that by following what they say literally and not the spirit, you are not showing loyalty. I firmly believe Ibn Taymiyyah would not speak like the Ibn Taymiyyah of the 7th century if he lived in our times. I believe this of Ghazali as well. I believe this of Tahawi as well. I believe this of any giant. That's my belief. My interlocutors do not agree with me, by and large. They might say they do, but in reality they don't, because their rhetoric doesn't change. I don't think Ibn Taymiyyah would be as obsessed with the attributes if he lived amongst us as he was 7 centuries ago. I don't blame him for his time and frame, but I give him enough credit to say, but see, that's the point. The followers of these movements, if you want authority in that movement, in that strand, you have to show fierce loyalty, ignoring the time, the place, the context. And this is why sectarianism really is so bad, because you are forced to resurrect the past in the present. You are forced to go back to a different time and place in order to establish your legitimacy, in order to show you are a faithful icon. So to be very crude here, being a part of a sect or a firqa is basically having a membership card, right? How do you pay your dues on the membership card? How do you validate that membership card? You have to constantly say and do something that will show that you are part of the gymnasium, you're part of the fitness club, you're part of that particular firqa here. And so as one of them says, orthodoxy, I quote here from one of the people who talks about this, orthodoxy, whatever it might be, because who's orthodoxy, whichever group you follow, orthodoxy functions as a marker of group membership, end quote. Orthodoxy functions as a marker, that's your card, of group membership. You need to do that in order to be a part of that group, and then in order to maintain that, you have to rise up in their ranks to become even more rigid in that orthodoxy. So bottom line, these are 5 psychological and sociological phenomena, each one of which is slightly different, and yet they're all converging on the same reality, which is sectarianism, as we understand it, is actually a part of a larger trend. And that trend is that when people form enough of a critical mass, then you can observe that as they divide, the more passionate they are about what they divide over, even if they're trivial, the more they will be threatened by that division, and hence the level of dissociation they're going to have from people that are relatively close to them is actually inversely proportional to how close they are. The closer they are, the more they're going to distance themselves from them. All of this goes back to the reality of establishing your boundaries, the narcissism of small differences, the concept of social identity theory, the cognitive dissonance amplification, and the competition for authority and legitimacy. And when it comes to religion in particular, there is a factor that makes it the most problematic, and that is you think God is on your side, whereas others would not say this. And with this, inshallah, we will see you in our next class. Sorry about no Q&A. I really thought I'd have a long Q&A, but inshallah, jazakumullah khair.